You won't find Elsewhere, Kentucky on any map. The overgrown gravel road leading to the abandoned settlement doesn't even connect to a main road. As with most places you shouldn't go, even the Google satellite images have been scrubbed with what looks like a bad use of a blur tool in an otherwise detailed area. It was located in the southeastern Callaway County, just off the shore of Kentucky Lake. Elsewhere sat surrounded by forest. Until recently, several buildings remained. I'd hear stories about Elsewhere growing up. Being a Callaway County native, I heard most of the local folklore and ghost stories. I'd spent several nights in the Asbury and Old Salem cemeteries looking to verify stories of creepy ghosts and the various monsters. The most I ever got was spooked friends and a bad case of the willies. I was volunteering at a senior citizen center when Earl, a man of about 80 years old, had told me a story about the fall of Elsewhere. It went like this. When I was a boy, my pa and I went to Elsewhere General Store to get some rock candy and chicken feed. I stood outside while Pa talked to Mrs. Elson, the shopkeep. Pa loaded the feed into the truck and handed me the candy. Right about then, there was this loud scream from the schoolhouse. I didn't know right well what was going on, but Pa told me to stay in the truck. But after that, we never went back to Elsewhere. When I was a few years older, I went back there with some friends. We was just some dumb kids fooling around. My friend Jason went inside that schoolhouse. I never saw him again. We spent the rest of the day looking for him, and later the police did a search but found nothing. Shortly after that, the county disconnected Elsewhere from the Highway 280. It had been about 60 years, and you're the first person to mention the place in half a century, son. I did some digging after that. The Callaway County Public Library has a pretty good archive of the town history and folklore. I had read every book on the subject, but it never mentioned anywhere of Elsewhere. I ended up at the Waterfield Library up on Murray State University campus looking through old microfilm when I found a reference to Elsewhere in the Louisville Courier-Journal. A single paragraph. Story covered how an unincorporated town was being abandoned for health and safety reasons. It was dated April 2nd, 1953. There was one detail that stood out to me. Located 2 miles north of Concord, just off Highway 280. I waited until Saturday morning, and I made sure I charged my cell phone before parking roughly 2 miles north of New Concord, just off the side of the road. I moved about 50 yards past the tree line and hiked back and forth until I found the remnants of Elsewhere Road. I followed it northeast for about half a mile before coming to a clearing where several dilapidated buildings stood, just over the tall grass and broken pavement. I moved closer to the center of the town when I saw the sign up to my left that read, Elsewhere General Store. The windows were boarded up and the door was nailed shut. But after pulling the boards for a few moments, I was able to pry open the door. The wood was weathered and brittled, and it popped right off. I was surprised to see that the goods were still on the shelves and in their place. Old canned goods sat rusted on old wooden shelves. Old-timey cash registers sat on the counter to my left, and several burlap sacks lay tattered across the floor. I pressed a few keys on the old mechanical register, and then pulled the lever to reveal several tarnished coins and some paper money. I had a sandwich in a Ziploc bag I'd brought with me for lunch, and decided to have a sandwich before putting the old money in the bag and stuffing it into my backpack. I moved toward the back of the store when an unexpected noise caused me to stand to attention. I got the distinct sound of footsteps on the wooden porch of the general store. I turned around and peered out the door only to see nothing. And then I called out, "Hello, anyone there?" There was no response. I crept towards the door slowly with my hand out in front of me, just in case. I slowly peeked around the corner before verifying that no one was standing outside, and then made my way back onto the street. I was sufficiently creeped the fuck out at that point. I decided to pack it in and come back later with my friends. It was just about then that I heard the crack of thunder. The weather app on my phone said that there was a 0 chance of rain, but lo and behold, the clouds overhead were moving in fast. I thought about hoofing it back half a mile in the rain, but the rain came fast, and not wanting to go back to the general store, I darted to the nearest building, which it was an old house. The front door was unlocked, and the door opened on a second pull. Standing in the parlor of this old house, I looked around at the old furniture and dusty floors, deciding to sit for a second on an old wooden chair that seemed sturdy enough. The storm raged outside, and I can see water coming in from the ceiling. There were several old papers sitting on the coffee table in the living room, and after a while I got up to take a look. The yellowed papers were single-page editions of an old periodical called the Elsewhere Gazette. The stories covered church events, pie recipes, and the advert for Elsewhere General Store. One of the papers in the stack bore the headline, "Tragedy in the Schoolhouse." The article told the story of a hysterical schoolteacher who had poisoned the cake she had made for her students. The one surviving student ran out of the schoolhouse screaming when the woman tried to force him to eat some of the poisoned cake. It was dated August 12th, 1936. Earl's story put him there nearly 20 years later. I was curious as to what would have happened some 20 years after the tragedy, but not entirely willing to continue investigating. When the rain started to let up a little bit, I trudged back towards my car. Around the time I got halfway down Elsewhere Road, the sky cleared up and the rain stopped. When I got back to 280, I marked the spot with a couple of fallen branches propped up against a tree and then drove back into town. That night I was sitting at Mary's kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee when Jerry came in and sat at the table adjacent to mine. Jerry and I didn't really talk much, but we would often find ourselves sitting there through the midnight hours drinking coffee and smoking some cigarettes. He tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You look like you saw a ghost, kid." I shook my head and said, "I didn't see one, but pretty sure I heard one." He got a confused look on his face, and I continued, "I did some hiking out by Elsewhere this morning." Jerry's face went pale, and he said, "Bullshit." I showed him a couple of the pictures on my phone, and he replied, "See that building right there?" He said, pointing at my phone. "Don't go in that building. Ever." I replied, "I take it that's the schoolhouse." He nodded. I continued, "What's the big deal about this place? Earl up at the senior center said that he didn't know what happened. I actually found an old newspaper with an article about 20 years before Earl was even there, but it didn't explain the scream he heard in the 50s. Jerry just shook his head and said, "Round here, we don't talk about Elsewhere in polite conversation. It ain't one of those things that needs discussing." But I can tell you're curious, so I'll tell ya. And then leave it be. I nodded, and Jerry continued. I was born in '59, about 6 years after they abandoned the town. It was the '70s by the time I was a dumb teenager looking for a thrill. My buddy Tom Blankenship found pictures of Elsewhere in a book up at the library, saying that the town was abandoned in a hurry. We drove his truck out there and found everything boarded up, save for the schoolhouse. Tom went inside that schoolhouse, and I stood by the truck. You could still get to Elsewhere Road if you didn't mind driving over some saplings at that point. Jerry lit a cigarette and took a long drag before continuing. Tom let out this wail like he'd been bit by a snake, and I rushed up to that schoolhouse expecting to see God knows what. The single-room schoolhouse was empty. I looked all over for him. Couldn't find him. I ended up going to them cops, and that was when they told me about the ghost. Jerry took another drag and stood up from his chair and moved across from me. There's this somber look in his eye that told me everything I needed to know about Tom's fate. And then he said in a hushed tone, "So them deputies tells me that every couple years some idiots go out there and goes into that schoolhouse, only for nobody to be seeing them again. Thing is, county sheriff's department, they knows about that ghost. They told me that back in the '50s, this kid came into that school with a machete and hacked a couple of the kids up. School teacher ran out screaming. They questioned the kid, and he said that that pretty lady that stood outside the schoolhouse from time to time, that it would send him to heaven. They ended up putting him under the jail." Jerry put out a cigarette and looked at me with a stern face. "I don't know what happens to people that go into that schoolhouse, and I don't want to know. Don't go back there. The county should demolish that place." Jerry left a $5 bill on his table and walked out. Despite his heartfelt story, I was even more curious about Elsewhere at this point. I paid for my coffee and I headed out. By the following Saturday, I had been able to wrangle a friend to come with me back to Elsewhere. Katie was a local college student who was obsessed with ghost hunting in abandoned towns, so it wasn't very hard to rope her into coming along. I told her the stories they had passed down to me, and that was all it took for her to wake me up at 5 a.m. Saturday morning with coffee and a camera ready to go. Katie and I strolled into the town a little after 7 in the morning. The sky was bright, but the sun was still barely over the trees. We decided to open the doors to the schoolhouse then and look inside a few feet. I opened the door and shot back off to stoop and back into the grass. It was dark inside and we couldn't make anything out. Katie produced a flashlight and shined it inside the doorway. I can make out a few upturned desks and, a chalkboard in the back. We stood there for a bit, and the sun started to slowly creep over the trees and started heating up the morning dew, resulting in a thick fog. I turned to my left for a moment to look back at the general store, and Katie darted past me into the schoolhouse. I ran right behind her, and we both stood in the dilapidated building. As I begged her to come back outside, she responded, "I could have swore I saw a kid standing in here." "Yeah, that's great, spooky kids. First time I was here, it rained out of nowhere. Now it's fog. Let's go." Katie walked a few steps forward and then let out a yelp as she fell through a hole in the floorboards into the cellar down below. I laid flat on the floor, reached my arm down for her to try to climb up. She grabbed my wrist and I grabbed hers with my other hand and tried to roll back, pulling her up. She wouldn't budge. I looked back down and saw this halfway transparent woman holding onto her legs and pulling her into this darkness. I pulled harder and harder, and Katie started to scream. The ghostly woman looked up at me and smiled in the dim light of the morning, shining from the door. Katie was pulled quickly into the darkness, and in the struggle I was pulled down into the cellar. Katie's screams fell silent, and I pulled a couple of glow sticks from my backpack and cracked them open. I tossed one in Katie's direction, and one toward the other end of the room, and brought up the flashlight app on my phone. Katie sat slumped against the wall on the far side of the room. There were bones all over the room, various states of decay. I walked towards her and checked her pulse on the neck. It was faint, but it was there. I turned toward the back of the room, and that's when I noticed a small sliver of light coming from 2 wooden cellar doors about 20 feet from me. I crept past the scattered bones and over to the cellar doors. I pushed them only to hear chains rattle on the other side. I pushed harder and kept banging at them until the hinges broke, and soon so did the other. I pushed the doors open and went back for Katie. I threw her over my shoulder. As I was walking toward the opening to the outside, I felt a sharp pain across my back. I didn't even look back. I bolted to the light. I tripped over one of the corpses and fell to the ground, my cell phone sliding across the floor. I looked back, and that ghostly woman was almost on top of me. I grabbed Katie by the wrist and took off for the stairs leading to freedom, dragging the young co-ed behind me. Just as I crossed the threshold into the light, I felt a tug and looked back at the woman who was now holding Katie by the leg. I tugged and pulled and cursed and fought. This otherworldly voice came from the apparition saying, "Let her go to heaven." And I shot back, "Go to hell." The woman's grip on Katie loosened, and I fell back into some soft grass, with Katie landing on top of me. I didn't wait around. Firemen carried her back to my car, and she came back about halfway through the ride to the police station. In my report to the deputy, I mentioned all the bodies that I had found down there. He would later tell me that they recovered 16 skeletons and 1 corpse that had only been there for a few years. The county board voted to demolish the town shortly thereafter, but it was still kept hush-hush. Elsewhere Road was tilled, and after the remaining buildings were bulldozed, and that cellar of the schoolhouse was filled with concrete, I went back out there one last time just to make sure it was gone. And I didn't make it 5 feet toward that tree line before a deputy sheriff flashed lights on me and told me to get back in my car. Katie won't talk to me anymore. Last I saw her, she pretended she hadn't seen me, and she scurried away. Of all the things that I experienced in that town, I regret not grabbing my cell phone. I had some pretty decent pictures on there. There's no record of Elsewhere, Kentucky, and now there's nothing left of the town. I haven't been back, and from the way the county has been handling it, I don't think anything's gonna go back. But just in case, don't go to Elsewhere, Kentucky. I hope you ghouls enjoyed this Kentucky creepypasta. I really liked it. I did try a more lazy style of video editing where you just put like a long video GIF thing going. Just because, I'm not gonna lie, I'm gonna be 110% honest with you ghouls like I always am. God damn, raising a puppy is so hard. Jude was such an easy newborn compared to this. Even a toddler. Jude was perfect until he hit 3 years old and he was a little jerk. But this is ridiculous. Constant, vigilant like watching this poopers. So I'm not gonna lie, I tried it. I've actually been looking how other bigger horror YouTubers edit their stories and stuff, and it looks like they pretty much just do put one long like video or one long GIF or whatever through the entire thing, which makes sense because I know personally for me when I listen to creepypastas, I just kind of put my phone on, leave it in the background somewhere, and just listen to it while I cook, I clean, I organize, I do laundry, whatever. Whatever I do, it's usually just on in the background. I don't actually vigilantly watch it like, oh, that picture doesn't belong there. So I'm going to try it this way. If you ghouls like it, let me know if you would like me to go back to having actual like pictures and stuff that match exactly what's going on at the story at that time. Just, let me know. I'll fix it up for next time. But thank you for being so patient and kind with me through this process. I am going to have a video out. I'm going to try to record it either over the weekend, possibly early next week, a video about Lucy and, why I got her, how we got her, what we're going to do, what our plans are, all that kind of thing. I'm going to make a little video about that, so you can look forward to that. And again, thank you, ghouls, for your constant support. It honestly means the world to me. So, yeah. As always, ghouls, the last video will be on the top left. The next video will be on the bottom left. All my social medias are on the screen, as well as in the description box below. And remember, there's always someone or something watching you.